All right, welcome to the sort of the beginning of the end of our lectures. This is the last module, and will take us through a couple chapters dealing with the modern world and the modern art and the movement towards contemporary. What's really amazing about what we're going to study is we have sort of a fast forwarding in the world, right? The industrial revolution is starting. People are traveling more because we have things like trains and railroads. Um, we have already moved through the Enlightenment, so people are thinking more about science and how we are. They've instead of using God as the center of images and painting and even our lifestyle, man has replaced that. And say, questioning, our own existence through that with those eyes or that lens. So what we're going to see a lot of work here is artists challenging the status norm. We'll eventually get into the term like avant-garde, doing work for sometimes even just the sake of being different, but challenging that status quo. So the first of those works that we're going to look at, challenging the status quo, is the Romantics. And I have an image of Delacroix here, one of the most predominant Romantics in that movement. And he actually had some work that was in the neoclassical era and then has moved forward. He's all about color, and he wants to give us scenes that are of the exotic, right? And that's what the Romantics are looking at. They don't want to do the same old images of Greek mythology or stories that have been told. They want to give us scenes that sort of like spark our imagination and delight our sensitivities. And so what we see here is sort of a reclining, that classical Greek reclining nude, and he's clothed her, but they're in a harem, right? We're looking into a harem, which at the time is even off limits to the Western men, Western world. Like you couldn't go into these places. This is the sort of the Eastern influence. This is here in Northern Africa. But we're looking at things that are considered exotic and sort of things that we aren't supposed to be seeing or be in touch with. Another movement that sometimes this term gets reused too liberally, the idea of realism. And realism, sometimes we think is anything that's pretty much representational, but it's not. Realism doesn't even have to deal with the objects themselves looking that real, like painted to their utmost detail. What we're dealing with is that artists were tired of painting fictitious sort of scenes, right? And those story tales, whether it be religious or mythological or something that's made up. And so with Courbet, who's the first to do this, and he does several works that really gain him popularity, is that he's painting everyday scenes, right? There's nothing glamorous about this. There's no hero. There is no sort of like dynamic composition, right? There's very little action. And this painting, the Burial at Ornaz, is actually near his hometown. He used even his family as models in this, and it's a regular scene. In fact, the grave itself is kind of just sort of open, where the fact as a viewer, we sort of like fall into it ourselves. But there's not a whole lot of symbolism or anything. It's just showing everyday life, right? And they are making some political commentary. So if you're interested in that, please check out the link. And I've also put on Moodle for you guys a lot of other films that sort of break down a lot of these movements in more detail, show you guys a little bit more about what each artist is doing. So please check those out if you're interested. Of course, the most popular of these movements is the Impressionistic style. I mentioned briefly when we were talking about Japan and those prints, how those became influential for the Impressionists. What the Impressionists did, and Monet is the father of Impressionism, the idea was that they realized they can use elements of art like color to depict a certain place, a certain time, all through sort of mood and feeling, right? There's nothing that gives us utmost clarity about the subjects, but we get a sense of everything that's going on. We understand that these are people, or we understand what the scene is going on. We don't need all those details. And with that, they get to explore color a lot. Renoir's piece here, which is massive. It's pretty amazing. Like they they realized that how they could utilize the idea of dull versus intense colors right next to each other, or how to make something seem really, really bright by putting it next to something that's really dark. And so when you look around this sort of piece, you can see these constant color contrast. But the Impressionists will sort of like continue to blossom as a style that even to this day is still one of the most highly sought after. A lot of painters love to do it still, and of course one of the most expensive. And when you see like museums selling pieces or on Sotheby's or something, so pretty interesting stuff. But highly, highly interested more in like being outdoors, being very sensitive to the sort of the plein air, which is when you go outside and you paint from life, from the sitting in the scene. So they're really observing nature for what it is. And the reason why they can actually do this and they can go outside their studios and paint is that because of the Industrial Revolution and the new materials, we now see paints in tubes now. And before, you'd always have to sort of like grind them up, and so everything was laborious and it needed to be in the studio. Well, now it's portable. So that's one reason why the Impressionists also are able to be so mobile outdoors. Now the Post-Impressionists, this is kind of one of those that's like, well, how do you really define this? And it's really, post meaning after, so after the Impressionists, and so they're using the tenets of Impressionism, but they're now, instead of just everyday scenes and just like sort of documenting life, they're interested in more of an expressionistic take on it. So they're going to use those brush strokes, they're going to use that color, but they're going to use it a lot more subjectively, and they're going to use it more as an expressive way to talk about feeling. So when we look at these pieces, on the left we have Gauguin, and on the right Cezanne. Of course, the most popular is Van Gogh and Starry Night, and we can think of that and the sort of those emotions. But if we started with on the right with Paul Cézanne, and there's a great YouTube link to watch there to talk further. These paintings were done later in his life. They were done. He did a series where he'd climb up to the top of this sort of mountain that overlooks a valley, and there's a village actually in the valley. So if you kind of think about houses and structures down there, you begin to see them in this mountain in the back, and we can see that sort of big brush stroke that it's just basically almost like he took the brush and just pulled that stroke down vertically again and again and again. And so we can see that impressionistic style. However, it's different, right? It's blockier, it's chunkier. He's dealing more with formal qualities, and in ways you kind of, when you see these in totality, you get the sense of like, oh wow, he's really sort of painting his last paintings. It's kind of can be dark. On the other side, Gauguin, we realize like, wow, he's really just using color subjectively, right? Using it pure color, almost like it's just straight out of the tube. He's not really seemingly attempting mixing anything. He's playing with spatial depth in a different way. The weird thing about Paul Gauguin is that he was, an impressionist that becomes a post-impressionist. Is he, basically, actually, I think he was a tax collector or a lawyer or something like that, and then later becomes a painter. And so he really did believe that he was the best painter. But he runs off to Tahiti, leaves his family, runs off to Tahiti, and lives out his life, there. And he's a little bit of a scumbag. He's basically sleeping with most of these young women and stuff, and that's why we see him in his paintings. And there's even rumors that, that he died of syphilis and that he gave syphilis to the entire island, which it's not true, but there are descendants of Gauguin still on this island. So it's very interesting. So anyway, but Gauguin himself is now really experimenting with just sort of flattening of the space, right? We're not really interested in depth as much. Everything seems to be a little bit more naive when we think of like sort of the classical renditions of a figure would be. Now, expressionism really is a term that just is going to summarize. It's going to be an umbrella term for a lot that's going on. What that means is that we are going to talk about a lot of movements based off of just feelings. They're going to overlap in time. We're going to have subgroups of artists in each of these little movements, and it's really sort of a time where everybody's experimenting. The reason why, and we'll look at this one first, is that what we have is sort of a breaking out of and that avant-garde, right? We're challenging everything that has been, because let's let's be honest, we have photography now. And photography has changed what painters can do. We don't have to worry about sticking true to the image when we can just paint whatever we want. And one example is the fauves, or they're known as the wild beasts. That's what the term fauvism is, right? It was a newspaper article when they first exhibited their works, led by Henri Matisse, and the newspaper described them as being wild beasts with color. And so what we see here is just completely arbitrary. The scene, allows us to kind of understand what's going on, but also not. The proportions, like we see this young individual is like super small, and in space doesn't really relate as well to everything. So we know that the artists aren't really paying attention to all the formal elements, and we have a lot of sort of classical motifs, but sort of combined in a new way. You may look at this and say, oh, this kind of looks a little bit like Picasso. Well, interestingly enough, Henri Matisse and Picasso, they actually really revered each other very much, and they were sort of like friends, or frenemies. They really competed a lot with one another and made fun of each other's work sometimes through one another, and there will be symbolic elements of like a Picasso nude, something like this, right, that then Matisse would steal, put it in his painting, but use it in a different way to sort of jab at him a little bit. So they had this commentary back and forth their whole lives through their work. And here we go with Cubism. Now, this is actually more of a post-Cubist, pre-Cubist piece, because Cubism had not been created at this time, and George Braque and Pablo Picasso are the ones who are given credit for creating it. They worked together, and they were interested in looking at subjects from multiple angles, from multiple point of views, and sort of breaking things down into their geometric tendencies. So that's really what Cubism is. And we see bits and pieces of that, like when we look at this figure over here. But we notice that two of the figures here are very much in masks. And what this is that they are, Pablo Picasso is actually really inspired by African art, African masks. He's seeing these at the museums as these pieces are coming in, and so he's interested in how that geometry breaks down. Now, in contrast to these three over here, it's almost like there's two pieces, like it's divided. But we do start to see the sharp angles come about, and Demoiselles d'Avignon is, within its title and within its nature, is an avenue, a street where prostitution happens there in Paris. And so we know this, like there's nothing. So he's not trying to hide what these women do. And actually, when he painted this, he did not show it to anybody. He was didn't really know what to do, and he kept it hidden under his bed. And it took a long time for it to come out. And when it did, it was not accepted very well. But then over time became sort of like the prototype we could see, because we realized what Picasso was doing later with his Cubism and studies. But definitely check out the link there. There's some really good information. The Futurists. By this time, we've already, we were into the First Great World War, and we also see sort of like life moving at a great speed, right? We have cars, we have railroads that are they're more predominant, they're moving around. The Industrial Revolution is hit its spike, so there's just lots of things happening, lots of people in business, the world just is changing faster than it ever had before, and the futurists wanted to capture this. And so, this is sort of a common looking man, but in time and in space, we can think of it almost like it was an animated cartoon with a bunch of blurry figures like around it, right? We would see it like as if it was in motion, and that's what the futurists were really trying to do, was try to show that motion and movement that was happening in everyday life. All right, Dada is very sort of interesting, because Dada in the term itself does not mean anything. The stories kind of hold true that in order for this group of artists, there were several of them, Miro, Duchamp, Man Ray, Yves Klein, all these guys, and what they're responding to is the First World War caused devastation that no one could imagine. And it almost put people into sort of like the stage of hopelessness and meaningless. And so if things were meaningless, then, art kind of also became a reflection of the society at that time, like it always does. And so they started making things that were kind of almost meaningless, right? To sort of, well, let's once again challenge the world. And the way they came up with the name Dada is that they actually threw a knife at a French dictionary, and where the knife point stuck, like through all the pages, as you peel those back, it was ended at the word Dada. And so they used it, right? It's kind of like this. And so that's kind of what the legend goes for how the name came about, but it really doesn't mean anything. And Duchamp here, and his sort of take on it is that he takes an ordinary urinal, turns it on upside down, and signs it R. Mutt, right? And calls it a fountain. Now, this is the first time we've ever seen like an everyday object just kind of pulled out of the rubble and put up for display. But this was huge and eye-opening. This is a replica. The original one, I think it actually was broken and only survives through black and white photos. But that was their sort of statement to the world. They would also take, like Yves Klein is known for this certain color blue that he would mix up, and he would challenge quote unquote figure drawing as he'd get a subject, have them naked, cover them in this blue paint, and then smear them around on the paper. So he's technically doing a figure drawing with a figure. And in the end, it was just sort of smears. And that's kind of what they were after, was sort of this freedom that says, why does it need to mean anything? Why does it have to represent anything? Why can't this be art? So pretty interesting. Check out the link on this. Surrealism is pretty popular for a lot of people and encompasses a long period of time and several artists. The most famous, of course, is Salvador Dali. And these artists are very influenced by the writings of Sigmund Freud about dreams and even keeping dream journals. So Dali would do this and sort of paint from his dreams the images that he saw. And from there, there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of representation. You can't really see it too well, but right here we have a pocket watch that's covered in ants. And like Dali would use a lot of ants in his work as they're sort of synonymous with him and death. Right? That was his sort of like theme, death. But we see how he's playing with the picture plane where things don't really line up evenly. Like if we look over here, we have this plane of what looks like water, but it's elevated and receding back. But then there's this other what looks like water, and there's not necessarily a clear horizon line. This tree that's somehow growing out of a box is close, but it feels like it should be farther away so a lot of distortions that are purposely happening. If you're interested in this stuff, though, check out the link because there's a lot of really interesting little clues throughout all his work. In sculpture, surrealism, this is probably one of the most famous pieces of sculpture, not only for surrealism, but for all of us, is, and we've looked at this already, it was Oppenheim's Lunch and Fur, this fur covered cup, and juxtaposing textures, juxtaposing what we would think is the norm into something that's completely new. All right, so we're moving forward. We're just right about into the 1920s, and we're going to move into the World War II era and really start to see a shift from art in Europe to now art in the United States. And the reason being is that artists were fleeing these war-torn countries, especially right before World War II, and settling in New York. So there's this huge influx of artists and talent, and then they start to train, and American artists begin to be trained by them. And so that's why we see the shift from Paris to New York City. That's why the art capital of the world now is New York City. So this is why. So we'll talk more about that. We're also going to look at a lot of interesting innovation, as specifically with the end of World War II, artists are now given newer materials or have access to newer materials to work with because that's what's left over. So things like linoleum, which were invented to be the floors of battleships, right? Something that's lightweight, but still a little bit soft and padded, and but didn't need to be like clean. Could easily. That's how linoleum came about. Other types of enamel paints. I'm trying to think of some of the other sort of inventions that we get, even down to like microwaves, right? Like there's a lot of new technology that comes from war research. So one of those painters is Jackson Pollock. He is what's known as the most predominant figure of the abstract expressionists, and pretty much the father of abstract expressionism. And he would do these works, and they are massive. They are huge, and he is rolling the canvas out on the floor, and he's walking on it and dripping paint as he goes, sometimes hovering above or standing just on the sides and creating these layers of drips again and again and again with this new enamel paint, right? This new stuff that's there, and it gets it really liquidy, so it just drips off the brush. In an interesting way, his wife is at this time his business manager, but actually she's the one. Her name is Lee Krasner, and she's the one who actually develops this. Like, she's an artist herself, but kind of influences her husband to do it, and he becomes huge with it. He does die in a car accident. He was very fond of drinking, and so he dies in a car accident, and then she continued doing that. And I think that's how we begin to see more of like her influence on him. And when we look at her earlier works, were much more this than his earlier works were. So another of the sort of abstract expressionists is also known as color field painting, and this Mark Rothko is one of the leaders of that, where once again, we're not trying to really represent anything. You could look at this and say you see a landscape, or oh, it's a hot summer day, or I feel like, well, all that's being evoked from color. And the artist is not putting anything in there besides those colors. So they are trying to remove themselves from representation. They're trying to remove themselves from anything that would even, quote unquote, evoke a feeling, even though all these still do. But they're really just painting. So color field painting, a lot of artists will do this. Some blur the edges, some keep sharp edges, but it's just flat colors. But like all sort of situations, abstract expressionism becomes the leading movement. It becomes what everyone now considers the canon of art. And as any artist or any person knows, well, that doesn't necessarily fly with them. So we have an individual like Robert Rauschenberg who takes a lot of tenets of abstract expressionist movement. When we look at this, we have dripping lines and everything. But he's just gathering materials from the street around him and putting those together. And so it carries on some of the similar theories of abstract expressionism, where he's just kind of putting this stuff together and he's not trying to evoke anything, but it's also letting like, oh, now we have text, or we have actual objects, or we have new visuals coming in onto this work. And he will sometimes use anything that he finds around the city block where he's working there in New York. And sometimes it's a taxidermied raven, which is in some of them, or a quilt, or some. I mean, he's just sort of painting on them. And this allows, since this is accepted, this allows artists to start branching into new things, where like this one here, which is happenings, which are sort of events, right? You had to be there in order to experience it. And they would just quickly set up, artists would just sort of quickly set up a show of their work, and then it would be done. Or they would do some sort of like demonstration and be done, or a dance or something. Sometimes they would, sort of burn even the remnants in the end. So there was nothing left for the gallery or museum or anybody, except maybe if you were there and you took a photo like what we see here. So it sparks these new ideas of like, well, what can we now do with art? And it's also the 60s, right? So we can really say and do what we want to do. And so now pop art, right? Pop art takes what Rauschenberg was doing, using everyday, common, popular, mass marketed items, and now refining it and saying, no, we're going to make art that's specifically about sort of the consumerist imagery that we see around us. Andy Warhol being the most prolific of that, is questioning, saying, well, yeah, why can't the beautiful colors of a Tide box be art, right? And so he remakes them, whether he's hand painting them sometimes, or in this case, silk screening, which is another new medium that's left over from the materials of World War II. And they start using these as ways of sort of like giving them basically a mirror to the American society and what it is that we are consuming. For the longest time, pop art sort of rules, and many artists, want to do even more with it. And we have always seen a resurgence back to classical art and the idea of just image making. So what we have here is Chuck Close and his early pieces that say, you know what, I'm not going to paint a subject that has any specific meaning. It's not a president, it's not a hero or anything. So they're using some of those ideas that we've seen in other movements. And in this, though, they're going to say, well, this person's not even popular, but I'm going to render them in such a highly realistic way that you can't help but to look at them, right? So like, kind of like how Courbet in realism was showing everyday scenes, Chuck Close is doing the same thing, except now he's just focusing on the individual. Some artists even say, you know what, I don't care about any of this meaning. I'm just going to make a form. And the minimalists would use primarily steel. There were some that used just light bulbs and stuff, but they're going to use what there's manufactured items, and they're going to take away anything that has any sort of like human touch to it. And so we just see steel boxes stacked, or a steel cube, or I've seen a fluorescent light bulb on the wall. That's it. Those are things that are minimalism. They don't seem to have any human presence at all to it. We also have the rise of feminism, and Judy Chicago, not only sort of the leader of feminism, but also creates probably the most iconic piece, The Dinner Party. But, women want a seat at the table. And so that's what she's literally doing here. She's creating a table setting for major figures of women that have sort of been left out of history or that we don't talk about a whole lot. So here's this whole setup, but now it's this sort of like a questioning of why don't we see women in the museums? They have a famous slogan of, why does a woman have to be painted nude in order to be put in a museum? So, they call the question that status quo, but now we're seeing artists as sort of activists as well, right? They're involved with the politics, they're involved with what's going on. And all that really sort of lumps and becomes sort of the postmodern. This is the Pompidou Museum in Paris, and if you ever go see this, what you're looking at is the architects, they wanted to invert what had been done before. So they take a building and turn it inside out. So now all the stairs, the ductwork, the electrical, everything that seemingly should be hidden is on the outside, and on the inside are just the sort of like, plain walls and stuff again. But on the outside, it looks like we're seeing the guts of the building. But postmodern is there to not only challenge, but to say, well, we need something, we kind of need a new term or definition to what we're doing now, because we're not just playing with color. We have all these other materials and technologies, right? We have the video recordings happening. We have performance art happening. All that, it's not sort of lumped in the same. So we have this new term called postmodern art that is going to be less about just the challenges. They're going to look a little bit more at society, I would say. It's maybe one of the best ways when I look at it now and try to define it. Right? And the last chapter, right? There's a lot to look at, a lot that we could go through. But let's just look at, what's just happening today, right? Here's art today. And, this just happened here recently in 2019 at the Art Basel in Miami. And there was a banana taped to a wall. And some of these did sell. They were for $120,000. And you got a 45-page manual on how to what bananas to go buy. and how to hang it on what color wall at certain height, at a certain angle, with a certain type of lighting, and all that. And is it art? There's a lot of films we can watch and that I've listed on your Moodle shell, calling into question, what is contemporary art? What is art today? And to even make it more, another performance artist takes that and just rips it off the wall and eats it. So here's an artist making art about art, right? It's not even his art, but now he's taking it, eating it, and saying, all right, well, we're done with this. So, I mean, this ball wax, this challenging of the status quo will always continue. And that's why we see bananas taped to walls, is because really all these pieces in ways have been bananas taped to walls. They've all been sort of our way of saying, well, what can we do with this thing called art? Thank you guys so much for paying attention, going through this with me. I hope you found something that you can glom onto and sort of find as maybe even your own favorite period of art. Feel free to email me with any questions, and this stuff will be on your final. So take a look at all those terms and the notes that I posted. Thank you.